Kelly, we're going to get started. Let's go right ahead. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is a public meeting in West Bend Joint School District number 1. It is Tuesday, April 30th, 2024, just after 4:30 p.m. And this is a board work session to discuss matters related to long-range facility planning. So Superintendent Wimmer, can you confirm the meeting was properly posted?
Yes, it was.
Great. As we've done before, why don't we start with introductions? Chris Weigert, school board member, go this way.
Jen Wimmer, superintendent.
Hello, Katie LaCour with EUA. Kit Daly with EUA.
Brian Brewer with Bear. Andy Sarno, School District Finance.
Quinn Trubla, Director of CNI, Curriculum Instruction. Melanie Erbett, School Board Member. June Kruger, School Board Member.
John Donaldson, School Board Member.
Chris Jenkins, School Board Member.
Chad Temez, School Board Member.
Tim Harder, Director of Facilities and Technology.
Also, we have someone joining us electronically. Perry, introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Chris. This is Perry Hinder with the Donald Brewer Plate Survey Strategist. So I'll shut my mic off now and I'll start speaking a little more later. Thank you.
All right, excellent, thank you. And I think we're also perhaps expecting Kelly Lang, school board member. She may be here a little bit later, but we'll get started. So our sole item to discuss tonight relates to long-range facilities planning. I'm going to turn this over to Superintendent Wimmer to kick this off.
Great. My friends, Kit and Katie, who were both at our sessions, might jump in at any point in time, but we really want to take time to dig into the feedback from our April engagement sessions with our community. So a reminder that we had a staff session as well as 2 full community sessions with over 150 attendees joining us. Over 45 staff members, 105 community members, just a little over 100 different feedback sheets collected from everyone. And also they had 2 pieces of homework, recall kind of their feedback sheet as well as an exit survey around their experience. So again, 99% saying that the session was valuable and informative. And again, we're always just checking in how we're reaching people so that we know to continue our outreach efforts for our community. So we had a nice turnout at our sessions. You know, we had a lot of competing events, spring sports, the dolphin show, so it was nice to see everyone and their participation. I'm going to take a couple slides and bring us back to the work leading up to those engagement sessions. So recall in the top red, we had a district facilities vision that we have been using and following, and the themes from our February engagement were very closely aligned. That's right below it. Gray, you could see our community members echoing their prioritization of safety and security, the efficiency and consolidation, and thinking about the future. So again, very well mapped to our guiding facilities vision from the teams. We use this slide in our presentation as well, digging a little bit deeper. What did we mean by that vision? What were we looking to do? So you could see things called out specifically around replacement of Jackson, right sizing by closure, addressing learning environments, specifically undersized and room usage at the high school. So those different pieces, those were kind of some details behind the big picture. And with that kind of taking in after our last work session, recall our teams all got to work looking at, to meet all of these pieces, what is a recommendation? So we brought this forward to you through a board work session, and this is what we took to our community, that larger long-range plan, and then we started chunking out in phases. But just a reorientation to that long-range plan, looking at closure of multiple campuses, including ESC, reconfiguration of grade levels, looking at Jackson as a K-8, and we dug into those. We talked about that timeline of closures not being until 3 years out because it's keyed into building a new school and kind of the road work ahead. So that's kind of what grounded everyone. What's the big long-term vision? And then what pieces are we going to attack in different phases? So just again, looking at, we were able to attend to the items in bold there in that detail. Things that we were having to put off into a future phase were those kind of revision of the high school, addressing some other pieces at elementary, but certainly taking care of those priority items that came through not just from our district, but from our community. We also provided our community with information regarding potential tax impact at 3 levels. Andy dug into those financials, and certainly Brian's here if we need to call on him tonight around that. And then we also added, after our work session and some feedback, what did that really look like for my home, so people could do that math and translate. So kind of based on those impacts, what would it cost me? What would it cost my household? So that was an additional piece. So again, these were all parts of the community feedback. So now we're going to dig in and hope to hear a lot of discussion from the board around the feedback from our community. So overall, there was a clear understanding and support for a long-range plan, and an understanding that for us that includes closure. So sometimes you see a lot of community meetings, certainly on TV, where you're talking about closing schools, and we've honored the emotion of that, and that our students and families in our schools are really important places, and they have amazing staff, but we'd like to get them in that environment. So there wasn't anything shocking. I think that's been a conversation that's been in the community for a long time. It certainly predated me. So again, the feedback we were getting, there was overall understanding for that. A lot of wishing it wasn't their school, but overall understanding for that need. There was significant appreciation for the data-driven approach, and we've seen that across all of our sessions. That feedback shows that it's comprehensive, it's informative, very transparent. And when it came to that conversation, especially when we're getting into school closure, that we were leaning on metrics and different data points to help kind of shine a light on a path forward. So there was appreciation for that, and also I think the way we're packaging it in chunks for people, and that they have full access to the depth and the complexity. If you're super interested in this piece, you know, and want to dig a little bit further, that's all out there and accessible for everyone. For anyone watching, I will just remind them that there is a dedicated long-range facilities plan on our website. Every work session, every conversation, media release, all the reports can be found right on that one page for you, so I would encourage people to access that. There was general support for rebuilding Jackson, and there were additional questions around that. So it centered around kind of that K-8, then what would the programming look like associated with that? How would it be different than our current Badger, if we're looking at 6-8 across those, and kind of that transition. So the first time Jackson's being integrated into the schools and community is 9th grade. Do our other families have access to that K-8 model? So it was around understand that we need to rebuild Jackson. That's not shocking to anyone. It didn't come through in any of our synthesis like, what? That needs a new school? Again, that conversation's been in this community for a long time. And we'll dig into some of those lingering questions and things, but you know, if anyone's got any insight or want to share additional about these bullets, that's fine, but got a couple more slides on this. There was general support for changing grade levels at Silverbrook and Badger to reduce transitions. Again, the additional questions in that theme, so understanding going to K-5 at elementary, 6-8, you could see support for that, understanding that those transitions made a difference. Again, questions around, so what does programming look like? Does my 5th graders still get all the opportunities that they currently have? What about this, especially if I were to split campuses on that 6-8 model? Again, going back to very specific program questions, which we don't really have the answer for at this time. We've got a 3-year runway in front of us to kind of get through details of that. But everyone is naturally gravitating towards where does my child go to school and what does that exactly look like, given those. So that wasn't surprising to us at all. Also not surprising were natural concerns and questions around their schools being closed. So not only for people who were in the audience and participants, and it was their specific school that was being closed, but you saw questions about having a presence on kind of the east side of our boundary, and if we lose Decorah, we lose a little bit of that Also, the neighborhood school feel, because our remaining schools would be congested in a specific area, and you're losing for Decorah, it's a very walkable school. Fair Park a little less so, but it's that sense of loss around a neighborhood school feel. I think also too associated with if Silverbrook became a larger campus, right? Everyone's very accustomed to a 300 student, feels like it's in my neighborhood kind of school. So there was just some natural feedback around that piece. I think one of the things to really navigate is there was some sticker shock at the potential for $100 million and concern about the community's willingness. In fact, one of our exit questions, recall, was what are you thinking about 100, 125, 150? And as that price tag went up, kind of their feeling of the community supporting it went down in that. And so one of the things that really came up around that sticker shock, if you will, remember I think the teams did a nice job laying in like, hey, we asked for a new Jackson before and it was this much. And then it went up to this much just naturally because inflation happens. And now we're looking at a different thing. There's concern even by Jackson residents and participants that they can shoulder a referendum of that size. That is what people sometimes feel like. West Bend residents may feel like, well, why do I have to pay for Jackson's school? And Jackson residents like, how can we carry this whole thing on our own? We've been unsuccessful before. So that really came through quite a bit in conversations and feedback. It's just that sense of worry around that. And again, we tried to set the stage of Jackson's part of our community. It's not like they're going to get to a size and get to graduate to be their own district. We are a conglomerate of multiple villages, towns, and Jackson being part of that. Any feedback thus far from anyone? Any pieces on that?
I'll say I heard the same sticker shock comments. Are you going to leave opportunity to talk about that a little bit later?
Sure, yep. We're going to talk about some of those different ranges and where we were at, but that's kind of that general sense piece. And again, we were watching, and I don't have it as a separate slide on the feedback because we only got 101 feedback pieces. Perry will get into that a little bit more on our intention to survey an entire community and get a much wider scope. But you could just see their perception of what the community would support diminish the higher that dollar point got.
It was also interesting because some people wrote, well, I would support,
Yeah,
like, so me, and then they would circle the higher numbers or whatever, and then they'd say community.
But-
like that. So it was interesting because some people the question was, what do you think your community would support? You know, some people felt
Mhm.
compelled to say what they felt strongly about. So it was an interesting dynamic conversation.
which is good. That's the entire intention of a next step being a survey, so they can convey how they personally, in a much wider swath of input for the board. And again, a request for continued communication and transparency. Again, we're getting high marks for the level of information we're making accessible, and that we are kind of changing how we've gone about this in the past, that we're engaging everyone all along the path to help guide the board in their decision making. So just wanting that to see that continue around any potential project costs and then survey results. So making sure that when we give that survey, we've got right now kind of a timeline where you would be looking at mid-June, all the results of that survey, and making that transparent to the public. Not just highlights like we do now, but also then how do you make some of that data accessible so people who want to learn a little bit more could see that. So that was one of those pieces as well. Any questions around kind of those big ideas and things that we heard and kind of went through for feedback? Every board member was present at a session, so you probably heard some of those same things yourselves. Anything else or anything that you're wondering? Okay, Chris?
Yeah, I wrote down some notes here. So one of the big themes that we talked about, at least at the table that I was at, was around the transition piece. So I don't have the background to know why we split to 5K and then 7-8, right? So there was questions about that. Well, that was put in place, how many years ago? Why are we reverting back? And then to add to it, if Jackson's now K through 8, that experience that that student goes through is very different than now somebody at West Bend who's at least going to transition one time between two schools, right? In a K through 8 scenario. And so they were concerned about, for better or for worse, those two students in two different communities are going to have a very different school experience, and then they're going to come together, at the high school. So
Yeah.
just some feedback. I don't know if we address it, but.
No, that's exactly like we said, wondering immediately about the program, then that delay in entry into the broader school community. We've talked a little bit, like you said, it is gonna be different. I can't afford to, and I don't have the space to build Jackson into a full middle school experience with a track and tennis courts and all those things. So also knowing and honoring full choice. Again, if that's different, if that's not what they want, what are their avenues either way to access maybe more in line with what they would like as a family? So we're hearing the same things. In fact, that's the biggest question I get as follow-up or reach out. Just had someone in my office today talking about that. What I can talk about in the past, and I alluded to that, and everyone's doing the best that they can with the data that they have available. So way back when they were making decisions, Andy resurrected out of the archives all the population projections, and they were looking at 7,000 students at the time. They didn't see the birth rate decline coming, nor did they have a crystal ball to do that. So they were planning for a much different future, as are we. That's what we're kind of picking up where we are and planning for our future too. And it didn't come back as a theme, but that's just one of those pieces we've been really cognizant of in planning, is planning for our future in a manner that gives us the flexibility to allow for, will there be growth in a decade, will there be do this. So one of the things that kind of myths was like, hey, if you close these things, are you so tight, are you so efficient that you don't have some room for growth? And that's something we said we could not do, because we wanted to be mindful, maybe in another decade, the birth rate will be different. I don't know. So it's, to your point, kind of why did we have some of the things we did in the past, as we go back in and have kind of those conversations with people who were here at the time. They were planning for the future they thought would arrive and be here.
One of the themes that came up at our table was the need to communicate or to provide the same information to community members who are not tech savvy or don't want to go to the website. So something,
So there's
other avenues.
there's a couple pieces in some of our feedback, and Kit and Erica from Findorf, myself and Nancy all sit on that communications team. And people sometimes are their future forward by a little bit on us. And so it's like, all right, now you need to be in every coffee shop, you need to be doing this. Well, first I need to know what phase 1 is. I don't have a roadshow yet, friends. I don't know. So when we develop that, to your point, then you look at saturating in all different avenues. But first, really, the board's got to make some decisions on, so what's our first step look like? And again, we've got it framed in a timeline slide, but for us, kind of keeping November in mind as a potential asking point, that means by August, you're getting that language down and making an official vote. That means, again, that we're really analyzing community feedback in June when they deliver it, and having really deep conversations June, July, so that you're poised to make a decision before you consider what you're putting on the November ballot.
Yeah, I think the communication conversations that I heard at the sessions were interesting because, to Jen's point, some of the tables were moving into how are we going to make this happen? Like, we haven't even figured out what it is yet, and we are moving on to how are we going to communicate. So it's actually
That's a good thing.
It's a really positive thing that people are talking about, sharing strategies and ideas about how do we communicate and what do people need to hear, and they need to learn this, and they need to, you need to go here, and you need to be there, and all that is great feedback. I think the survey tool, Harry will show you, has some questions in it that allow us to better understand communication preferences. Where do you get your information so that we can tailor that communication that way? And I think one of the things you have to kind of balance in every community is the perception of communication versus the need for communication and how you do it, right? So some communities have been very light on actually mailing things to community residents, right? Because there's a perception that if it's really expensive to mail things, it's actually not that terribly expensive, but the perception is that. So we've been hesitant to do that in the past. So if we hear that the community needs print materials because they're not going to go to the website, or they're not going to be on social media, or they're not going to come to a meeting, then we need to find the right strategies and invest in how to get communication to people. And so I think we do the survey, the community feedback at these sessions, generally continuing to look for ways to reach people. It's all the different methods that need to be considered. And we'll have a really good idea, I think, after the survey comes back too.
Just because I don't remember, when participants RSVP'd to the community conversation, did they say how they heard about it? Or got
Yes, we had
it?
exit surveys, talked about how they got their information.
Great.
Yeah. And quite a few indicated that they were first aware of them through the postcard mailing that was done back in February, which is kind of honestly a test. We did that with like, okay, are we gonna get pushback on mailing something to every household? Or are people gonna say, oh, this was really helpful? And I think that there wasn't. I never heard that there was anything negative about it. And we certainly heard both in the February and the April sessions that was the first kind of alert to people, followed up by the media coverage that you've gotten, the communication. You know, we did some actual ads and papers, things like that, to try and balance those between those that are electronic and those that are, you know, just looking at what comes in the mail.
So so unpacking that feedback, kind of in looking at that path forward, certainly our presentation focused on, if my remote would work. Did I lose power? Might need to reboot that, and I'll let you do that. One of the pieces that we tested and took, Brian instrumental working with Andy, and Andy presenting those financials and talking about those pieces and looking at options for survey and price points. I lost it.
Yeah.
There you go. Advance me by one. Thank you. So certainly we went through and went into detail around kind of that base phase one plan, that 100 million, taking in consideration those secure entries, some prioritized capital maintenance, Jackson as K-8, converting Silverbrook to an elementary, and then maintaining Green Tree and McLean and moving some early learning in there in that piece. So that's kind of what that phase one plan looked like as an option one, and kind of that base. And that was that $100 million sticker shock. Because remember, in the past, I think the strategy was find a price point and try and fit everything into a price point bucket, so they weren't maybe aware of kind of the scope and complexity of needs. So kind of putting it all together. The option two that we talked about was, remember, we weren't putting the district office offline until a next phase. So in that option two plan, it was getting us there faster with those efficiencies, taking the remaining ESC offline and some of those alt ed. It was very interesting. I had a follow-up conversation like, why does that cost $20 million? It doesn't cost $20 million to relocate our operations. So that was a point of feedback I got after. But what it does is we envision being moved to the high school. So once I trip into the high school and I do that, I create a domino effect into all those other rooms, which I can then touch and take care of some of the issues at the high school. So that's what that is. It's not a new $20 million spot for central office or to take care of some additional programs. It's to trip into the high school and start attacking that layer. So we might need to do some clarity around that, as well as some additional capital maintenance that Tim spoke about in detail at the meeting. So that was kind of looking at that next price point. If you think about them as 100, 120, and 150 was kind of how we bucketed them largely. And that last option was really expanding the capital maintenance, taking off a bigger chunk, taking a bigger step forward out of the gate. and looking at that in context with, that's when we dug into, so what did that mean for my household, my personal tax impact, what did it do to our mill rate, all of those things. Another piece that I heard, and I think Andy and I talked about too, was, yep, it's great to show our mill rate, but again, even with that increase showing that we're much lower than we have been, we're still lower than the neighbors as well. So we talked about folding back in some of that context so people could see, because maybe they've only lived in West Bend their, last couple decades, so they've lost touch with, so what's it look like in the region? So adding some of those. So we went into detail around each one of those kind of expansions would look like and what that impact would be. Certainly know through Brian and Andy that we have the ability to ask for that. It's again, finding that sweet spot of when we go to our community and ask, what would they support? So it's understanding that. So breaking down those pieces, and Perry will speak to it, but breaking those down for surveys so that we can get community feedback on where they are with those.
We actually had to try to, we had to pivot a little bit from the communication in the community conversations, which laid these out as phase 1++, because it was getting quite messy to follow that. So this is exactly the same scope and exactly the same information. We've just framed it slightly as, there are 3 options for phase 1 community, right? We're looking for your input. Do we do 100 million? Do we do 125? Do we do 150, for example? And it's all the same information. It's just starting to make that little bit of shift. And that was really based on your feedback at the previous workshop, which is why we incorporated the 125 and the 150 in those metrics for the community conversations. So not new info, it's slight different shift in how to talk about them.
And kind of giving you detail and bullets underneath to reference, and then always leading back to where they can find a little bit more detail, so that they can see, so what is it that you get, what does that mean? Because again, we're trying to understand what phase 1 looks like so that we can build a long-range plan, right? I can't figure that out until I know exactly what that first step looks like. And I can build some pieces around it. Not just with what the work is ahead, but to Brian's point around how we then have a financial strategy to support a longer range plan, not just a first ask.
So just, we gaze into the crystal ball, and this is what we put in front of the voters, and let's say the voters said, we like option 1. I'm assuming that if we said, okay, we'll proceed with option 1, if we were to go back to the voters in the future for another referendum, it might be for, hey, remember that option 2? We're gonna nibble away at that, or option 3. I mean, is that correct or not? If it were, it would have a nice added advantage of, if we are gonna nibble this off, they've at least have heard about option 2 and option 3. Like, hey, remember that whole thing about closing the ESC and incorporating it? We wanna tackle that now.
Yep.
That would be kind of nice. Doesn't always work that way, but I mean, is
It's a
that?
bigger slice of the same pie. To your point, I'm not changing anything necessarily, I'm just taking a bigger portion out of the first
Right.
step.
And
And
certainly,
all of it makes sense. So to your point, Chris, yes, if they were to focus on only doing the first option in the first phase, and then down the road, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years from now, you want to come back and continue to go to the next phase of the long-range plan, you would have a step and further steps already articulated. Of course, they'll cost more, so don't forget that. But you will have the logical progression. Yeah.
nor is there a guarantee 3 years down the road that these are the most pressing
For
options
sure.
either, but
Right.
it would have that logical step, but.
And recall, Tim went over that part where when we were talking about that capital maintenance, I mean, I wasn't looking to the stuff in, I've got it a little bit ahead, in some of the green columns, I'm just gonna bypass this. You know, I'm taking care of like those critical pieces, and that was a piece that we teased out in communications was, we keep calling it options, I'm like, oh, this is needed, kind of maintenance and pieces, so we were just talking about that, and making sure we weren't inadvertently reinforcing like, oh yeah, and these are fancier options or something we could get if you want to ask more. I'm like, no, this is the next layer of need.
Yeah.
So good feedback around just how to help people process that, because it wasn't, you get anything bigger and fancier, you just get the next layer.
Right, and you'll notice out of the yellow priority 27-28, which is the year this could be completed, there's a total of $100 million of capital maintenance needed by then. The most expensive option only covers 50 of that 100 million. So that's only half of what's truly needed at that time. So it's not being superfluous.
Yeah, right.
It's
And
bare minimum.
to that point, just making sure that everyone understands that. So again, when you create a long-range plan, like, oh, I knew this in the beginning, and they are proceeding along a path.
And communicating very openly and transparently that when you talk about a long-range plan, and this is phase one, you have to be clear that there will be future phases. Or else we're setting yourself up for failure down the line. Like, we have to really, really communicate that
Yeah.
openly, and then once a project is successful and you're moving through, it's gonna be branded, phase one,
Yeah.
more to come. You know, I mean, the idea is if you don't, there'll be an assumption that you took care of everything. And unfortunately, you won't take care of everything as you know, at these scales. But you're taking a really important first step, so it's gotta define it.
So I'll just back us up where we talked about kind of that visual associated with the phase one, that first option at 100 million. Again, taking some offline, but not that full efficiency. Getting to that next part of phase one was then, again, getting the ESC district office offline, and so that you could capture those efficiencies and move that forward. So setting us up to test those pieces, and again, making sure that that in that next option is, so where's that to take that next bite out of the necessary additional maintenance?
You can see that the ESC has come off of this list, right? Because this would, in this concept, this is option 3, you've taken yet another building offline, you've avoided that building's capital, maintenance needs as well. So we're trying to update these charts as you essentially take steps through into that significant capital maintenance need, so you can kind of keep seeing what you're chunking away at.
So one of the biggest, questions around information, we talked a little bit about that too, but, things that people were pondering, we're looking at requesting more information or understanding was around, why isn't McLean being closed? And people who, again, access the information or were part of the conversations, understood the multi-data points that were used to help make that selection. But without that, there is kind of general wondering around that. So needing to get a little bit more information out to the public to understand, because that's one of the questions I get, because their perception is decor is newer. So again, the slides that Katie or Bob went over, kind of highlighting how did we get there around those metrics are really important to reiterate to people. And then looking at more information around capital maintenance needs district-wide. So understanding to make a connection for people, kind of going through not just the big chart that shows us those big needs, but then there was a perception that started kind of festering around, well, we've waited, we've done no capital maintenance at all, and this is why we're in this kind of predicament. That's false. We continue to invest in capital maintenance. This board is the one who has a committed fund. You grow at 4% annually. We've done that. But as we talked about, there were several really lean years where we're kind of trying to dig out of that. I can't do that without a significant boost. So a little bit more information on capital maintenance for people. And again, really digging into Jackson as a question, what would it look like to be K-5 for Jackson? Because really wrapping their head around what would programming look like. And then there were some supplementary questions around the site being large enough for Jackson. Katie did the digging in on that. If they were sizing for a school of that site, it's anywhere from 10 to 17 acres. Depending on how do you go to a 2-story or 3-story and all that. Again, remember, we weren't designing anything, we're just showing them a blob on a map. So that site is just shy of 14 acres. You're coming in at 13.7. So how you design that would accommodate that. And again, not going for a total middle school concept. And then interest in understanding and digging into, so when we do take those buildings offline, what do we yield? How would that contribute to those pieces. What does that really mean financially? And then a lot of what ifs, again, you heard this a lot around, especially that kind of shouldering that Jackson referendum piece and that price tag was, what if this doesn't pass? What happens? And I said, first I need to understand what the first step is, and then I can build the plan around that. But I don't have direction just yet on what that first phase looks like to know how I respond. I think that there was sometimes a perception that somehow if we don't pass, we avoid school closure. That's completely false. We know that we still need to right-size the district and do that. It's just, will we have the dollars behind designing a space to ready it for some of those pieces? So those were just some of the big questions that are still lingering, as well as those themes. It means that's an opportunity for our communications team to get that. It's probably questions you might still be wondering about, but again, there's some pieces where I can't answer just yet. We have to figure out what some of those steps are so that we can frame answers. But it's what people are wondering. So again, that was digging in for us then. So what are our options for survey? Reiterating those that we're looking at kind of a phase one that kind of gets bigger and bigger to figure out where's that first bite, right? Because we're just guessing what the community thinks, and that's not the best approach to go for that. So again, reorienting you to those pieces, and we talked about that maintenance. Any questions about that piece? Then I'm gonna get ready to turn that over to Perry, because what you want is to be led by an expert in the field on getting more feedback out of our community as we wrestle with these questions. So Perry, you good?
You're all good. Thank you for moving to the next slide. Let's keep it here for a bit, because I don't want people to have to look at my face too much other than what's on the screen. So, thank you. So, I've got a script, everyone. Again, I'm happy to stop after each slide to see if there are questions. So, good evening. It's great to be with you tonight. And I'm sorry I can't be here in person, as my wife and I have been in Atlanta for a week helping out our daughter with the move. For those of you who didn't attend the work session earlier this month or are streaming the meeting live, my name is Perry Hibner. I'm the lead survey strategist for the Donovan Group. I'm excited to share information about the upcoming community survey we have developed in consultation with district leaders and representatives from EUA, Findorff, and Baird. Before we get into the slides, I wanted to provide a little background information. Over the past 3 years, we have worked with approximately 50 school districts, public school districts, administering surveys, including staff climate, student engagement, parent satisfaction, child care, and various types of community surveys, most related to potential referendums. All right, now you can go to the next slide, Jen, and people can see me just for a second. I also want to note that I'm a huge proponent of engaging stakeholders, and a survey is one of many tools to do so, and results in what we like to call two-way communication, which is the best kind of engagement. Before I joined the Donovan Group, some of you know there that I was the Director of Communications for the Milton Cross Plains Area School District. We took great pride in our engagement efforts and surveyed staff, students, families, and our community often. I also believe surveys are important for residents who don't have children in our schools, as it allows them to learn about what a school district is doing and provide feedback. And these are the people we don't consistently hear from. Finally, a reminder that we are supporters of public education and are certainly happy when the results from, in this case, an upcoming survey are positive. However, our number one goal is that the results are accurate. Okay, Jen, go ahead and move to the next one. Thank you. I'm not a proponent of reading what is on a slide, so I'll let everyone take in the 5 bullet points related to goals for a community survey. What I will note is surveys, as I mentioned previously, are a great opportunity to inform your community about the work that is done. In this case, regarding the district's needs, the process used to evaluate those needs, the solutions that were considered, and why the long-range facility plan that was developed for West Bend and the phasing being proposed is the right one for the school district and the community. I worked on 2 successful capital referendums during my time with the Middleton Cross Plains Area School District. The surveys not only helped us determine what the community might support, but helped us identify what issues would come up or questions between the survey and the election. And an important note, the first referendum we passed in 2012 was the first successful referendum for a new school and MCPSD in 16 years. Because I think there's a tendency to think it was really easy to get it passed. It was not. So with that, any questions so far? I'd stop and ask after a slide or two. I didn't think so. All right, next one, Jen. With any survey, the higher the participation, the more accurate the results will be. A good completion rate for community surveys is typically around 15 to 20% of a district student population. With that in mind, we would like to see at least 1,100 completed surveys when we open up the West Bend survey on May 13th. However, because more than 30,000 school district residents voted in the November 2020 election, and any question would likely be placed on the November 2024 ballot, we'd actually like to see somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 completed surveys to more accurately represent the number of people who are expected to vote. In addition, we want to see solid numbers across lots of demographic groups. For example, if we finish with 1,500 completed surveys, but 1,450 of them staff and district family, our data would be skewed and likely overly optimistic. On the other hand, if we finish with 1,500 completed surveys, but 1,450 of them come from residents who don't have a direct affiliation with the district, our data would also be skewed, but this time likely overly pessimistic. Finally, we want the survey to take respondents no more than 15 minutes and preferably question 10. Studies show significant drop-offs once a survey goes beyond 12 minutes. And I'm referring to the quantitative question or statements on the survey. Survey takers who fill out qualitative or open-ended questions or statements will stay with the survey to its entirety. Next slide, Jen. This is a slide my colleague Tracy Jentz included during an earlier presentation, so I won't spend much time on it. I will note the preparation for the West Bend Community Survey has been very unique, as it is a complicated story with lots of parts. District leaders, along with representatives from EUA, Findorff, and Baird, have been very patient and helpful as the Donovan Group has gotten up to speed, learning about all the work that has been done and walking us through all the options to be tested. You can see I bold-faced that last bullet point. We've done a lot of versions of the survey to get to this point. Next slide, Jen. We break the beginning of the survey into 3 sections: demographics, communications, and just general information or general questions. The demographic questions are vitally important as they help us with desegregation of the data, which I will speak about more in a couple of minutes. In addition, these questions will be even more important as there are parts of the solutions being considered that impact district families due to school closures. Generally speaking, if the district's families are divided over a solution, it is almost impossible for any district to have a report plan. The communication question, both Superintendent Rimmer and Nancy Kunkler determine the best tools to reach respective audiences in the coming months. As the one thing I can assure you is district families collect their information using many different methods than those who aren't affiliated with the school district. The satisfaction statement in the general sector often sets a ceiling for support for a potential referendum question, and I think the reason is obvious. Residents who are satisfied with the district are more likely to be supportive of the plans the district has related to facilities. On the other hand, residents who are dissatisfied with the district are less likely to be supportive, even if it is the right plan with little or no tax impact. I will note we recently completed administering a survey for a public school district in South Carolina where satisfaction levels were below 50%. However, support for 2 of the 3 options we tested were well above 50% because the community understood facility needs and challenges the district is facing. So, while I hope to see high satisfaction levels, we've at least seen some times where it isn't the end-all be-all. Finally, the narrative is the district's opportunity to tell its story. The challenge is to provide enough information that survey takers understand those challenges and the solutions and why the plan makes sense, but to not take so long doing so with the information that someone drops off and doesn't finish the survey because that data doesn't do us any good. Next slide, Jen. Thank you. This is an important one, and it's a new one for everybody there. This is a chart EOA and Findorf have been working on that we want to include in the survey right before we test dollar amounts, tax tolerance, and what is included in that amount. It's similar to a graphic we have used in other community surveys, and feedback from respondents in those surveys indicated it helped them understand what they're getting with each option, which you can see this one does as well. So with that, Jen, let's go to the next slide. We wanted to show you what one of these statements will look like that people will offer their opinion on. So we are currently planning to test $3 ones, 100 million, 125 million, and 150 million on the survey based on feedback and discussion I heard at the last work session. The 100 million number one option will be directly below the chart I showed you on the previous slide, and this shows you how we phrase statements related to dollar amounts, tax tolerance, and what is included. Some people are visual learners and others prefer to read, so by including a chart and text, we try to cover each type of learner. I sometimes get asked why there isn't a neutral or not sure response offered. The problem with a neutral answer is we don't learn much from it, and when we are reviewing and analyzing the data, it makes it challenging to determine just how much support or opposition there truly is to the option being asked. So we like to remove that and force people who are, it makes sense, they're probably either going to choose probably for, or probably not for at that point. Before we move on, I will also note we plan to ask a logic question of the $3 amount statements. If someone responds probably not or definitely not to those three statements, they would then be asked to explain why. We are also considering asking them if there were a dollar amount they could support. The challenge there is we have to show them the tax impact of what's at 75 million, which I know Brian's been working on. He had all of 24 hours to work on it. But we don't want those respondents to think they can get the same elements of the phase one, option one offering, because the school board and district will then have to decide what to do if that amount is what the community will support. And I would also add, and this isn't part of my script, one of the reasons we like having another dollar amount is, and again, I'm just going to use examples. Let's say we get 30% support for 150 million, 40% for 100 million, or 125, and 50% for 100 million. Well, logically, you might assume that 75 million would then get 60% support. But that's not the big assumption. And I'd rather rely on data to be able to tell you what kind of support there might be for lower numbers than making guesses based on the numbers we have in the survey. All right, next slide, Jen. Thank you. After tonight's work session, I will make updates to the survey based on your feedback. I want to give district leaders and representatives from EUA, Findorf, and Baird the next couple of days to provide any final feedback before we upload the survey to our online tool. Early next week, district leaders can test the survey and offer suggestions, and we are ready for the survey to go live on May 13th. Postcards have already been produced and are expected to arrive in all households in the district no later than May 13th, and possibly before then, so the survey will be open in case someone gets it earlier. But that gives residents about 2 weeks to complete the survey. I'll have a draft report later that week and with results and analysis, and we'll be back in June to present the findings to all of you. And in case you're wondering, we typically find that 95 to 99% of respondents will complete the survey online. But paper copies will be available for any residents who prefer to complete the survey by that method. And then next slide, Jen. Finally, I want to share a sneak preview of how we desegregate the data as it relates to dollar amounts, tax tolerance, and options. And I can certainly desegregate it further if the board or others want to have other, additional categories. This was one of 4 statements we included in a survey in 2023 for the Grand Forks Public Schools in North Dakota. All respondents includes everyone who completes the survey. The comparison group are those who don't have a direct affiliation with a district and are less likely to be supported. We then provided weighting, giving 70% comparison group and 30% to those directly affiliated with the district. And the reason we go with those percentages is because in most communities, 70% of eligible voters don't have direct affiliation with their public school district. I said usually because while those results have been very accurate in the past, they were off for surveys we offered in fall 2023 for districts that put them on the April 2024 ballot. So I'm also going to look at giving a 75% comparison group because quite frankly, I want to make sure I don't overemphasize or oversell any one of the numbers that we test with the community. So with that, and I know I didn't stop, sorry, when I went through the slides, I only stopped once, but I'm sure there's questions. I'd be happy to answer any of them for anyone.
So Perry, we're talking about 3 options potentially. I'm assuming, and I'll use extreme examples just to illustrate the point, a survey that had 20 options would just be a blizzard of options and probably not very effective. Is there an optimal number? Obviously, we don't want to make up options that we don't want. I mean, if we only have 2 options, we'd probably go with that. But is 3 excessive? Do we have room for 4? What about 5? Just out of curiosity. Just to
Like an
test
option
it.
here.
You bet.
Great question. I'm glad you're not asking one. I'm not a fan of districts who ask one, and I've worked with a few who have. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through the numbers. So with 1, what survey respondents understand, or survey takers will say, let's say in case they don't complete it, is that what you're only really truly asking is, will you support this or not? It's not really a two-way dialogue, if you will, here. So we're proponents of multiple. I would say 4 is the maximum we encourage. I think once you get past 4, it's overwhelming for people. They don't really get a feeling for what are you trying to accomplish here, especially if you're trying to do phasing. So I like having 3 here because, again, I think it gives us also, like I said at the last work session, it gives us an opportunity to be able to make some assumptions on where people may fall if 100 million doesn't have enough support. And again, I'm kind of jumping ahead, as you'll hear this on June 17th, but the reality is that you're going to see 3 sets of data, but the data that's going to be most meaningful, everyone, is the weighted group data. Because your district families are not only going to be supportive of your solutions. I mean, certainly at some point they may not be able to afford it, and then at that point they say probably not or definitely not. Some may not be supportive because of the school closures, but the majority of them are going to be supportive. The problem is that, like I said earlier, in any school district, they don't make up the majority of eligible voters. So we weight that, and you're going to see there. So I've got one survey open right now, and Kit and I has been getting about it. We have 72% support for a $75 million option. But as I noted to the district team, that's not what it's going to end up being when I get to weight it. It's probably, I'm hoping it's going to be about 60 to 62%. So you need to have a lot of support from your families because the comparison group will definitely bring it down. Going back to what you're asking, Chris, though, I think is an optimal number here. But again, what we're really trying to do, what the team felt like when I mentioned that logic question, is for, let's say that 35% say, I won't support anything. Some of them are going to tell us there's nothing you can do. There's no reason why. I'm not supporting anything. We're really trying to hear from, let's say, that remaining 35%, maybe 15 or 20, and see, okay, is there a number that works that can still benefit the district, even if it's not 100 million? But again, like I said, we got to get the community to understand it doesn't really deal with your full phase 1 that you want that really helps the district move forward in terms of your long-range plan. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's great. Good questions. Chris?
So Perry, first off, thank you for doing this. I've done survey work in all the different hats that I've worn, and there's a lot of value in getting that, input to really have that two-way conversation like you're talking about. So my first, I guess my high-level question is the goal of the survey to get buy-in on the plan as presented, or is it for feedback for alternative options? As in, we talked about the Cora versus McLean, right? Are we getting that kind of feedback, or are we only saying this is the plan? If that's the plan, what's your tolerance as far as funding goes?
So, to be honest, I mean, certainly we want to write a survey that's going to be as easy for people to understand so you get good feedback. What I often get asked, Chris, when I come to present after a survey's closed is, what would you personally recommend? And my personal recommendation is to trust your data. So the thing is, I want this survey to be clear for your community so they understand what's been done to this point and why this is the plan that's being brought forward to the community. The hard part with some of these is, and I'll use a different example, Chris. Some districts will often ask us, and their partners like the UA and Findorf, should we include pictures of drawings and things like that? The problem is people then start vociferating about that and nitpicking there, rather than focusing on what's being proposed to them. So, the other piece, so to go to your second part, Chris, if we get a lot of qualitative feedback about Decorah and Fair Oaks or versus McLean or Whitford, that stuff will be shared, but again, I think it feels like they have solid reasons for why those two schools are the ones being recommended for closure. So what I find with the qualitative data, just like a lot of the February and April community conversations, they really present your talking points as you're going out to the community over the next few months.
And then I just have two smaller questions that you can answer. In your illustrative charts, are you going to define capital maintenance? We know what that means, but I think the average person who gets that might not. And then the other piece is, how do you prevent participants that are outside of the district or duplicate entries?
So let me answer the second one first, Chris. So what ends up happening is, the people who would be outside of the district would be like, for example, staff members who work here but don't live in the community. So when we're doing the weighted group, they will be removed as I'm giving the 30% weight to people who live in the community and vote and have a direct affiliation, but it won't include anybody who doesn't live in the community. So they will be in the all responding group. Now the reality is if we get 1,500 surveys, my guess is staff members who don't live in your community will make up maybe 3% of the total number of people. So not nothing, but also not, I would say that's not significant in terms of moving the needle, especially once we get to weighting things. As far as the capital maintenance, I'm going to defer a little bit to Erica and Kit. What we have right now in the survey just talks in general terms about capital maintenance. It does not go specifically into it. And Chris, one of the reasons why is that challenge when we're putting together a survey of not getting so much down, and I don't want to say in the weeds because this is going to be important to some people, but not spending so much time going into something that somebody then clicks off and doesn't finish the survey from there. So that's been the struggle right now, is trying to make sure we explain all these different parts, but not going into so much detail that we turn somebody off from it. But I don't know if Kit and Erica want to add anything to that or not.
We do have a section up earlier in the narrative that explains capital maintenance and the type of projects. So the
And
goal
the
is,
premise.
yeah, hopefully in the whole concept of what we're looking at and 3 different options is the way to get there. It's what we're struggling with and why there's been so many versions.
Perry, this is Jen, can I just take us back to Chris's prior question around security? A little bit less around who's filling it in, but how do you keep it protected and secure, meaning anyone can't grab a code online and fill it in maliciously or falsely? A little bit more about security.
You bet. I actually used to answer this question for that district in South Carolina, but we did it afterwards. So everyone, the way that works is we don't, unlike school perceptions, we don't give a unique number to everybody to take the survey. It's open to anybody who receives the postcard, but what we do is we monitor IP addresses. So if we see an IP address has done multiple surveys, and when I say multiple, I should say at least more than 2, we then go in and we look at the responses. If the responses are identical, and what usually happens with people who are trying to, let's say, manipulate a survey, is they're going to copy and paste everything, including their qualitative answers, okay? So if they've done that, we remove all but 2 of those results. And the reason why we go down to 2 is, we're not going to assume that grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles live in the household, but we'll assume that maybe there are 2 adults, and we'll count 2 of those results, but we won't count more. Now, there are other things we do. I don't usually like to go into a ton of detail, especially in an open meeting, because I don't want to give people who have ideas in doing surveys ideas. But those are the first things we do for anybody who's wondering.
That level of detail is good, that you have procedures in place to keep the survey secure and targeted and to its intended audience.
Well, thank you for saying it that way, Jen. I probably gave more information than I should have. So, Jen, I know I interrupted you, so I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about the capital maintenance or safety piece. So.
No, just trying to work through the narrative and keep it tight. It's been a really unique challenge that we're still working through.
Good with your questions?
Yep, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, working down. John. Jude?
Yep, I had a question. So what we're doing here in the survey is to present these options to our community members. And if there's an overwhelming option, let's say option 2, everyone is excited about, and we have over 50% support in our community, then you're telling us that will support our, there'll be input into potentially picking option 2 as the question that will show up on the November ballot. Is that what we're getting to here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
This
It
data will
could be up to all of you to decide using the term overwhelming, what overwhelming support ends up being. You know what I mean? But that's the gray area for school boards, and I think I mentioned that last time too. You know, what has been good about yours is that there are clear things that are gained from going from 100 to 125 million and 125 to 150. Sometimes there's not, and so districts will see, well, we have support for 100. It's a coin flip at 125 million. Could we go for 110? I think more in this case, it's like looking at those exact $3 amounts and seeing which one works best.
Jim, it is a good question, and maybe for members of the public who are watching. This survey is not binding on the district. This is really designed
Correct.
for information around, should we narrow options? Do we have great options? Should we expand options? So that's a good reminder.
Should you proceed with this time frame?
Right.
I mean, those are all, this is a tool in the toolkit of how do we tackle and address our facility needs as we do long-range planning? How do we have authentic engagement with our community that tells you something before you get to the ballot? And we have worked on projects where the data has come back and the community's clearly not ready. They're not in a good place for it. The solution isn't working right. There could be a whole bunch of factors, and those projects have not advanced based on survey input. That's what this whole process is designed to be. It is transparent, and I think as always, I think Perry said this before, we always say when you survey, you have to be prepared to live with the answers to the questions you're asking, which is why we're always mindful of asking the right questions and why we work so hard to develop communication to support it.
John?
The one thing that I kind of see that somebody might have a question on is term of payback. I know we've talked about that before. This doesn't actually outline, this is a 30-year commitment,
20.
or 20 years even. So, nobody would know that we're not planning on stretching it out 30 years, looking at potential survey questions there.
And let me say, what we typically include in all the surveys is how long the payback is, what the interest rate is being used to determine what the tax impact would be at this point. And again, all districts try to be very conservative in terms of their approach to the interest rate, because if interest rates go down, that's a win for you and your taxpayers, because that means the tax impact would be lower. And then also what you're expecting your equalized property value growth to be over that time. And again, I would say that every district we work in or with is very conservative in that approach, because again, if you're conservative with it and equalized property values go up higher than that, again, the mill rate impact will be lower. So,
Perry, I think one of the important things that you shared when you were here last time, I think you were face to face, but you shared, related to the survey where it's not binding, it's the indicator, and it's that, you're trying to find that statistical consistency to determine what the community would support. But the important piece there is you shared last time, I think it was very, very small percentage that would swing by the time that it's supported with the board resolution to the voting date. 2 to 4% either way is about it. So I mean, that's why we're dealing with such a important piece of information here. Is that accurate?
that is accurate. So I've worked with one district where it moved more than 4% in a positive direction. So and I'll remind you of that again when I present the results, but just keep that in mind as you're looking at things. And I will say, the only district where that happened was my home district, and we worked like crazy to get an operational referendum through in 2022. And the district could go with the smallest amount that they asked is what they decided, so they don't have a median size amount. But Andy, the one thing, and I was alluding to it in one of the last slides, the one thing I want to look at the data even more as it's coming in and as we're desegregating it, because what we saw with the 7 districts we worked with who had questions that we wrote back, is that the amount what we saw in the survey was lower than what we saw when the general election came in by more than, let's say, if we were doing a polling margin of error. And I think I told you last time, when Bill and his team did that for you in 2019, they were wrong to do it because they do convenience samples as well. Convenience samples aren't scientific surveys. I can't tell you we're within plus or minus 3. What I can tell you is X number of surveys we've done, and here's the range of what we've seen in terms of what goes on. But Andy, you're right. Typically, it's been 2 to 4%.
I would also say, John, that, first of all, we're still drafting the survey, so there's room for that suggestion. Second of all, the level of detail that you're talking about is also where the website communication paralleling the survey is really important. So Nancy's already been working on that as we have used all this information in the public sessions that we've had, these community sessions have had those key assumptions in there. We need to make sure that if you're looking for more information on what are the financial assumptions behind some of these borrowings, that they can find that information. So if the website is sort of your library, if you will, of all the background stuff.
Yeah, but you're gonna have lazy people that aren't gonna wanna go
For
to multiple
sure,
places.
correct.
So
For sure.
the more it's, in front of you, easier accessible, then I think it's gonna be better, so.
Yeah, that's something we can definitely consider.
I think point of getting together and discussing so that we can frame that.
I think the biggest challenge really, frankly, honestly, was the complexity of this project and the levels of change that were potentially, in the mix, and how to balance the communication of that with the asking of questions about that without overwhelming them. And Perry really is being generous by saying there's been multiple versions. There's been a lot. We are it's Google, so you can't even tell. I mean, there's like 3 Google Docs. That's how many versions of this there are, let alone versions of edits. But we're getting there, and I think we're really trying to be consistent with what we've communicated in these, hour-and-a-half long community sessions, and now have to get down to the survey that someone will read most likely on their phone, right, and not disengage from. So what is the most critical information? What is the clearest information? How do we make sure that they stay engaged and give you the feedback that you need? That's really what we're working through.
And there's speaking, after you mentioned that, I remembered I was gonna ask. So I know he had mentioned about if a survey goes too long, people lose interest, we won't get it. If a survey does take somebody longer than expecting, someone gets in and thinks we're just gonna take a couple minutes to do this, and they get partially done with the survey, are we gonna capture any of that data, or is it just lost until they hit submit?
We only take completed results. The reality is the other hard part about that is then that would create a whole new layer of going back and checking to see if they came back and finished it again and not, and again, I'm not saying they're trying to manipulate data, but it would feel like that we were counting them more than we should. So no, we only take it if it's a completed survey. I will say that what we find is when we work as well, about 75% of people who jump into the survey complete the survey. So that's my goal for this one is 75 to 80%. To see 75 to 80%. So like we'd see 2,000 people jump into the survey, but 1,500 were completed.
And I think that's one of those, as we said, we front load information, telling your audience, this is what it's about, here's where you get that information, here's what that intended time is. I just got one at home too, and it's like, oh, this is gonna take me 10 minutes, I'm gonna set this aside for right now, or like you said, they're setting aside a little bit of time. So making sure we're foreshadowing what's that commitment of time and what's the topic so that they can kind of be ready to sustain and finish. That'll be important.
I'll look to see if I can beat that time.
Just
Yeah, you get a big like surprise at the end.
Is it like your GPS? That's how I have my GPS.
Well, in the reality, let me just say everybody, so Jen and her team will get the link to the survey when it goes online and have 2 or 3 days to test it. If that's something the board wants to do as well, we've had some boards that want to test it as well. We appreciate the feedback. The other thing is I always tell you, take it at 2 things. 1, take it and time yourself. Because if I tell you it should be 10 to 15 minutes and it's taking you 18 or 19, I'm concerned, obviously. But if it's taking you in that range, then say, well, what have I, I don't know, what have I turned off on page 5? And at one point, I think we had 13 pages, so we don't want 13 pages. So, but then the other piece is sort of take it as though you knew nothing about this. It doesn't make sense. Because that's what we have to assume is a lot of people will jump in here and they haven't, as much as you've done great work trying to educate your community, they assume that they have not been following it, paying attention. And will they understand as a result of taking this and give us good feedback?
Harry, has your firm ever utilized focus groups or test groups where you say, let's just take 50 random folks, run the survey by them, and see what they have to say around, this made sense, I had no idea what this meant. Is that a practice that's commonly used?
It's not, one, because of cost, to be perfectly honest. It costs some money and everything to do all that and facilitate and everything else. The other piece is, honestly, what we try to do is, and Erica, for example, had one of her team members take it who knew nothing about the district. And so some of our changes that we've made have been a result of what Emily shared with us. So I don't necessarily, Chris, it's a good idea. I think we don't have to do it with 50. I think we can probably do it with a few more, So, but I also don't want to have the survey out there too many people before it's supposed to be open either, so.
So we've got, I just put up your timeline again, it's me, Jen, just talking about where we've got access to, and we've got a little window to test. So that's what we would utilize. Instead of formalizing a feedback group, we would do a test. Grab that feedback, synthesize it, and be ready. We've got kind of in this timeline in mind to be ready to give it a try and respond.
I know I would appreciate if we can be part of that test group, just because at the end of the day, those results are going to come back to us, so.
We would anticipate
Okay,
that.
great.
I would also just make sure that we're all cognizant of the timeline of getting the survey actually live, because the postcards are being mailed, right? So we can't, it's like.
Don't
anything
delay,
else.
we're not going to delay.
It's like anything else, we could edit for many
Sure.
weeks, and we need to actually get it in the hands of people, so you can get feedback back in June, because you need to leave yourself time between those June results and an August action, if you're going to move forward, and as your team, we need to be able to help you respond to that feedback, make changes if necessary, evaluate how it impacts all of the things, and, very critically, the financials. So, I'll just need a little time in the back end, so.
Harry, here's a question that likely there's no good answer to, but I'll ask it anyway, of course. So the 3 options we've laid out in this draft all are 9 figures, $100 million or more. Have you seen in other communities that is sometimes just an artificial showstopper, that just seems like too much money? And I'm sure that depends on the community and how big it is, but can you give any advice on that? Is that something that's a warning sign that we should be worried about? Is it something that, no, it's par for the course?
No, you have to know your community, and all of you know your community better than I do. I mean, I know your community through the meetings I've been going to, and by trying to do a lot of research. And I'll be honest, I brought up early during our discussions, I've looked at all your referendums since 1990, and which ones have been successful and which one haven't. And the idea that, even the most recent one would work out to about, with inflation, not construction cost inflation, would work out in today's dollars to be low 40 millions. And so that's a big jump from that to 100 million, no doubt about it. So, and that's why, again, but you have a lot of needs, right? And the community needs to understand that. I've worked with some districts that put a question on the ballot knowing full well it's probably going to fail, because they want the community to know, look, we got to do something here. And it's not going to be cheap to do something. So, I mean, Chris, I'll go back to my first full year with Middleton. We decided we were going to go to referendum. And we were scared of going to 60 million, so we asked for 59.8. Now, was there any logic behind that? Heck no, there wasn't. So, but that was the number that we felt like artificially people would be nervous about. Now, in reality, we probably could have gotten 70 or 75 passed pretty easily. Kit knows because she worked with us in 2018. We got 138.9 passed, and we could have gotten 160. We just didn't have an option. So the community understood. We asked for what we truly needed. We would have asked for more if we could have, but we couldn't get to 200 million, which is what we needed for the next option.
So I'm for sure not gonna ask for 200 million, even though it would be nice. But just to correct for anyone watching, so our last one was around 50 million, which scaled with inflation would actually be much higher, not 40 million. So that would be larger, and again, one of those, maybe the strategy then was to pick a price that would be acceptable. What we talked about in strategy for this survey is certainly testing the 100, 125, 150, but as Perry was talking, he was talking about that logic question behind, if they say no. Because I said, what I need for my board is, if it comes back no at 100 million, what information am I providing the board so that they can make a decision? So that was when he was talking about that logic question behind, saying, okay, if not any of these, then what? So that you're still receiving data that will help inform, you know, whether it's, to Kit's point, whether we're tightening that design up, shifting in a different way, or pausing for a second. But we wanted to make sure that the board was getting information. To Perry's point before, you don't just ask a yes or no question, right? You need more information to inform your next step. So that's kind of the design behind. So that you still get data, even if they said no at 100, what data do you have? What information do you have?
And Jen, just, sorry if I missed it, what I was referring to before was the last referendum that was passed would work out to that number. So I know they asked for 47 million in 2019, so, but it didn't pass, so I didn't want to, you know, I want to use one that passed and say what your community supported in the past, what it would work out to.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So it's really about, like I said, refining what we're asking so that the board has the information it needs, because you have some really critical decisions in front of you that impact everyone in our community. So your entire goal has been to have consistent, frequent, full engagement of large sectors of the community. The survey is a tool, as Kit was saying so eloquently. It's a tool in your toolkit to help inform and guide as you are faced with decisions.
I mean, I think your feedback about the logic question would be really helpful to know. That is absolutely just a number, right? So we have defined scope and projects at 100, 125, and 150. We know we could keep going more, right? But based on what we heard last time, those are the three options that we have built and we're testing primarily. That's what we talked about in the community conversations, et cetera. But if we go to the logic strategy and we have if not any of these, then what? We need to have a number with that also correlates. We can't just have like a random number, because then we wouldn't know how to get there, right? So part of what we're suggesting, wanting some feedback on, is what should that number be? Should we test 50 million, 75 million? Those are at least solid increments that are similar, 50, 75, 100, 125. And with that, there would be associated tax impacts. But if you ask those questions, you have to be ready to live with that. So, I mean, 50 million is half of what option 1 is, which is not all the way to getting you to right sizing, which is the first step in your long range plan. So it's your decision to make, and I think Perry's strategy that he's a lot, created for you to get that data is helpful if it's needed, because people are not supportive of option 1, which is what we've been saying is the first step in the long range plan. So I think some guidance on that would be helpful. I think Brian's been doing some math over here, could tell you what those numbers mean, if you need it.
And some thoughts, Chad, go ahead.
Yeah, do we have any insight as to whether there'll be any other financial ask referendums expected on this ballot?
In your neighborhood?
Yeah.
I mean, from the same municipalities? Good question. Have you heard of any other?
No, the only kind of larger project was Jackson just passed on a 4-3 vote, the addition to their community center to attend to the early learning classes, a 4-classroom suite. So that was a tax impact to them, I'm sure, some way. So that came through. Moraine Park as a taxing entity already passed their referendum prior. I don't know or have any word of any additional, sometimes there's safety questions, those pieces. There was one from the county that just came through around that. I don't anticipate another one back, but so no additional pieces expected.
Kit, the question you asked is a good one around, all right, well, what number is it? And I'm almost loath to throw out a number without knowing, well, here's almost option 0.5, if you know what I'm saying, is what that might look like. And as I look at this, I think, the discussion among the board members, and I don't mean to mischaracterize it, is I think we look at this and say, well, all of this makes sense. And so it's not like any of these are really a luxury, so to speak.
Right.
But when I look at option 1, and Chris, I think about, the feedback that you have, and as it relates, the big dollar chunk in option 1 is Jackson. And I think we all agree we need a new Jackson Elementary School. I know I heard the same feedback around, well, why is that K-8? Because what are we gonna do about track and all that kind of stuff? Now, I remember in talking originally that kind of that Jackson Elementary replacement is a bit of a linchpin in the process, because as it relates to, well, we need to draw some 7th and 8th graders because it creates capacity. I just want to be sure that there isn't an option there, because I'm assuming if we said, you know what, no, let's make Jackson a K-5. I'm not saying I'm in favor of this, I'm just throwing out ideas. That would be a smaller school, it would be a smaller footprint, which would be less dollars. I have no idea if that would save $1 million, $20 million. But my point is, when I look at this, that is about the only thing that I look at and say, gosh, if we were to scale it differently, because it's hard to half close a school. You either have to close it or you can't, right? I suppose we could, pull back on priority capital maintenance, but we've got to get going, and the security on that's hard to say, well, we'll kind of make a secure entrance. So I'm loath to suggest this, because I really think that the K-8 idea in Jackson is a good one. But as it relates to if we were going to be serious about coming up with another option in case $100 million doesn't go, I don't know that there's another option, to look at. But maybe the answer is no. Without that being the K-8, that linchpin, it just doesn't trigger the ability to close the other schools. How do we?
I was just going
I'm
to
sorry,
address
Katie.
it.
Yeah, sorry.
I just want to jump in to answer your
Please.
question. So we did look at the K-5 configuration. Obviously, that would make an equitable elementary school configuration across the district and be the most ideal. We communicated a bit in the community sessions that would overburden Badger and therefore require an addition to Badger to accommodate those 6th, 7th, and 8th graders.
Yeah.
Because that would be a construction project at Jackson and a separate construction project at Badger, that would be more cost to the district for something that would be temporary in terms of your total population decline over time. So you'd be adding on to Badger just to see a decline in population and then therefore in the future unused space. We also explored a K-6 configuration for Jackson, since again that would be a smaller building and therefore a less financial burden immediately. However, people had even more concern with creating a different configuration for Jackson, those 6th graders then coming into Badger at 7th grade, different than the rest of the district. So, and all of that is very complicated to explain. So as Perry outlined, we want to reduce the narrative associated to get to a really clear, concise story to explain to people. So when we consider doing a lower tax impact and considering one of these less than ideal options, it became very clear that it was confusing and complicated to explain the complexities that go along with this plan that doesn't fundamentally work. So that was our challenge in terms of outlining that as a lower tax dollar amount.
So we did initially speak a little bit about that in some of our sessions, because I can name, it's 126 students out of the gate, and that you need it only for maybe potentially 4 years. So I can't remember if it was like the first sessions or in some of the work sessions. So when we looked at that, so I'll say it, but I know that others administratively in this room will back me on that. K-6 should not be a recommendation. It would not be an instructional recommendation from any of us. We only would entertain K-5 or K-8 just because of the complexity of that and the inequities that could occur instructionally across those campuses. So ruling that piece out, and then looking at, to that point, can you remind me, when we were looking at kind of opening the door on that being over by 125 kids, give or take, what capacity were we looking at that
I think the
school?
total capacity of Badger is 10 1,044 students, so it was over capacity by 126, so.
And there's different layers of
Yeah.
capacity that
Yeah.
we looked at, and I
Yeah.
just don't remember, you and Bob would know, and we can certainly get that information. There's different levels of capacity
Yeah, so we,
that we would look at, and I just,
yeah, so when we evaluate capacity, we look at being 90% full, and that is because it's never going to be equal. Like, you're never gonna have the exact same amount of 8th graders as you do 7th graders. So we consider what we call functional capacity, which is 90% of actual maximum capacity that you could fit in each grade, to not overburden the school at any time. So it was 126 over functional capacity, essentially.
I mean, when it boils down to it, if you pick a lesser number to test in the community, you feel that the feedback is that they'd be supportive of 75, but not 100, we would rally around, how do we create the best phase one around that data? What's in that? There will have to be some compromises, right? You'll either have to choose to build less of a Jackson, right, which impacts the long-range plan. It doesn't mean it's not possible. You might have to choose to do less capital maintenance, which is really hard to fathom when you see the volume of capital maintenance needs you have district-wide. You think you wouldn't begin to tap into those, but it's an option. So you would have choices, but until we have that direction, we don't have a $75 million plan in our back pocket, right? So that's an example of why we need time, because if that's the feedback we get at the end of June, we need to circle pretty quickly around what it is that you want to include in that 75. For example, if you go further, less than that, it just gets even more painful, quite frankly, right? So that makes you start to wonder about timing, I
Yeah.
think, quite frankly.
Just thinking about some of the comments I've seen online, I think there's some confusion around, initially, there was a $229 million price tag
Capital
thrown out there for capital maintenance. And I think some of the confusion is, people are saying, why is it costing $229 million to downsize? Which would be a fair question, except that's not really what we're talking about. So I mean, I think here, it's $100 million or $125 million would essentially right-size us, which is downsizing or consolidating. The $229 million was if we did nothing and just had to maintain the current spaces we have. So I think it's important that that narrative, does not exist, that people understand that we're not asking for $229 million. That's not the long-term plan. That would be the long-term need if we did nothing else different. And that this plan costs money, but it costs less money than if we didn't have a plan. And that's what I think a lot of people online who haven't attended sessions, which I always encourage them to do, but I think that's the problem, is that people who haven't understood that concept, they're seeing this because of whatever media is putting out there. This $229 million is the cost that we're gonna come and ask for at some point. And I think
that gets into this, and as you said, if they participated, they saw that one where you grade out and avoided $51 million in capital maintenance, avoided by, again, closure, efficiency, right sizing. So you're saying that's circulating and part of that, so.
And also that was over a 15-year time span as well. I think that's also important to understand, is that this is not, we don't need that money right now, and then we're gonna have ongoing maintenance in addition to that for this whole time. This is the money that would extend out the 15 or 20 years to cover that. It's just it's just why it's so important to get people directed to the informational sessions, because the numbers out there now,
This looks like a bargain.
compared to the other one, you get something new for it at least.
Well, I mean, it's something for you to think about and give direction to, and sooner rather than later, if you want that logic question to be kind of a backup to, if none of these, would you support? It could also be an open-ended question, but it's hard to get quantitative data from an open-ended question, right, Barry? We talked about that?
I put myself on mute, so accidentally. Yes, that's correct, Kate. We refer not to that for that reason. But if we have to, we will. because again, one of the things that the team talked about yesterday is, and again, I mentioned it during my presentation, is there will be people who will answer a logic question and say, it's not the tax impact, it's the fact that you're closing my kid's school. There will be some who will say that, so.
And there will be open-ended fields for them to do that, right? So that was the other
Correct,
thing.
yeah.
It's not like they don't have the option to express those thoughts. You will see that and get a summary.
This is not considered, currently, this is not, would not be considered an operational referendum, correct?
Correct.
So if, let's say that this was shot down for whatever reason, and we're stuck with all of the buildings we have, and the $229 million need exists or whatever, would that then become an operational referendum? We're like, well, okay, so you don't want to do any of this, well,
So-
then we need
A couple
all this other
pieces.
money to just keep operating? I mean, that becomes an operational referendum at that point.
A couple things. So first of all,
Some
if
of
this
it's
gets shot
cold.
down, and we don't know what this is yet. So as soon as we define what it is, then we can work on what happens if it doesn't pass. I would anticipate we're still closing schools without a referendum passing. It just shifts my approach in how I go about doing that.
Right.
So I don't have to immediately lay out an operational, well, you didn't do this, so now I have to maintain everything. That is not true. You can still close schools and do that. I would still advise that, just to be real clear. And then, to that point, I'll let Brian and Andy take on, there's different mechanisms to fund different things in those, but again, all budgets, you're tripping into need for operational dollars around that, and you can do that for all sorts of things. So how you want to craft that, and then if you're looking at kind of if there's not support in fall, first of all, hopefully there's survey data that helps refine that so that we can get something over the finish line. Otherwise, you might be, to Kit's point, waiting for spring, waiting for another opportunity. So I don't know if you want to jump in on the operational options for a district financially,
Yeah.
but
So again, that question that's phrased that people vote on, that's for funding, additional funding. So it's for the district to go into debt and for the district or the board to allow for the levying of dollars to repay that debt. Similar in operational referendum, because of the revenue limits, it's the authority to go above and beyond that by the dollar amount that's stated in there. So those are two questions, and I've been a part of one ballot having both of those questions at the same time. That is actually probably more common than you think it is. So it doesn't necessarily mean, we're asking to issue debt for projects that are listed in the question. Operational is a totally separate thing. So we're not asking that at this time. We forget that we did have an operational question. There's even two different phrases of those, for 5 years, 8 years, whatever. It's for a defined period of time versus one that's indefinitely there. We had an indefinite one. It was for technology back in 1999, 2001, something like that. We had one for $950,000 for technology. Now, I could arguably say it's gone. It was there, it was given to us, it was built into our revenue limit, but because we've been picked up by that low spending threshold multiple times now, that extra $1 million is not there because we're still at the bare minimum of statutory
Yeah.
allowance.
so just so no one walks away from this thinking, wow, they have an extra $1 million for
do
technology.
not.
No, we do not.
No.
That ship sailed a long time ago.
But we had a recurring referendum for $1 million. It's not there. But Tim's budget is bigger than that, and that was used for technology throughout the district, so.
And obviously, the impact of trying to tackle capital maintenance needs that are the large ones that we've identified here as part of your regular operating budget. If you were to just add them to your operating budget, the cost is, the impact is very high. That's the whole concept of.
And inefficient.
And it takes forever to accomplish them because you can't, you have to spread them out over the 4 to 5 to 8 years that your mill rate's increased.
But I think that the message about, these are not luxury items that we're asking for. These are needs that we have for the district to keep things operating for our students the way that things operate. And that should this fail, many of these things will still need to happen, but it's gonna happen at the inconvenience of our students, which is, I think, a big deal.
Yeah, I think to your point, Jen, that you've been saying, this is about developing and using this survey to ask questions before you get to that point,
Sure.
right? We want to ask questions that inform you and guide you so that you feel confident and comfortable going forward in November. If you're not those things, don't go forward. Don't risk a failure of this significance. You've been down that path. It's taken you several years to recover from that for a whole variety of reasons. So being mindful of that's important. You know, our goal would be to go when you're ready with the right plan that your community, that you feel confident your community is likely to support. And this survey data can be a really strong indicator of that.
If I could just ask, I'm sure November was picked, one, because of timing, and two, because of the amount of responses, right, we'll get for voting. But Perry, maybe you could speak to what has been the success rate after you've done surveying, a group decides to proceed, November elections versus spring elections?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and actually I won't even say it has anything to do with surveying. I would say that what we found in Wisconsin historically is the most, school districts have the most success with capital or either non-recurring or recurring operational when it falls on a November presidential election cycle. So second most successful one is a November gubernatorial election. Third one would be April, the April election. Then after that, it falls off significantly for any primary and special elections have a really low success rate. So, and you hit upon some of the reasons why. Certainly the larger the turnout it tends to be, the more successful school districts are. As far as the overall percentage, for capital ones over the last 30-some years, I think the success rate is between 65 and 70%. It's ebbed and flowed. I mean, there's been times it's been a little better, it's been a little down the last couple of years, but it was really high for the, the 10 or 12 years preceding that. But where it was, capitals have tended to do better because people can see when they understand that district needs buildings, so they can see the new building and what, why it's necessary. The operational ones are the ones that have changed ever since 2010. We've seen a much higher success rate there, and I know that's not what we're dealing with, but I just wanted to make sure I explained that. But yeah, November 2020, November 2024, those are higher success rates than any other elections between.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Can I throw out a number for potential 0.75 option? How would the number like 79 million, it's not quite 80, it's not 75, I don't know how that hits, you're on the high end of the 70s, but you haven't gotten to 80. We could still accomplish several of those items on the list. I don't know, if you're looking for a number, that would be my advice or my opinion.
Well, what I said to the team yesterday was, and again, I said it during the presentation, I don't want to give an impression to your community that there's a $75 million option. What I want people to understand who are getting this logic question is, because if you ask me that, if I'm a resident, you ask me, well, what's the lower number you can go for? My first response is going to be, well, what's the tax impact of that lower number? I don't know. I've only seen the tax impact for these three other numbers. So I said, I feel like we have to be clear. We're not saying that this covers option one, the complete phasing of it, but this is what 75 million would allow, would be your tax impact. And then the district will determine how that money is used. So again, and if it's somewhere between a support for 75, if we get a lot of people saying 75 million, and I added that to the 100 million, and we had support at 60%, could we go higher than 75? Yes, but again, going to that point you brought up before, if you want to use overwhelming as the term, I think you want to give yourself a little bit of cushion too, right? Just to be safe. I mean, I know some districts say, I just want 50 plus 1. I'm never a fan of 50 plus 1. I'm a fan of giving as well you can for support, because it also sets you up for the next referendum if you need to do that. And we know that based on the approach here, there's going to probably be more than one referendum question for West Bend.
Perry, the question on the table was 79 million. That's not a 75, not an 80.
Yeah. No, I would prefer that we use it, first of all, because it gives the impression of survey takers that we have a $79 million solution out there. One of the reasons why we debated 50 or 75 million is just because it naturally follows the progression of 150, 125, 100. without trying to imply to people that we have a solution there. And that's the struggle, right? And I thought Chris was gonna ask me this before, when all of a sudden, but people sometimes will say during these things, well, aren't people gonna go for the lowest dollar amount? Depends on who the person is. I'm gonna tell you that your residents who don't have kids in the schools, if they're gonna support this, yes, it will likely be the lowest dollar amount. But your families are gonna take the dollar amount they can afford that has the greatest impact on their child or children. And so one of the things districts have to do is, let's say you end up going with, and I think we'd all be happy, thrilled with 100 million, we'd certainly be more thrilled with a larger dollar amount. But there will be some people who take the survey who say, I want 125, I want 150. And we have to be able to explain to people why we may have to explain to people why that may not be the right solution for the district at this time.
Yeah, and Perry, I was tempted to ask that question. But I think the difference here, and other board members can agree or disagree, is the way I think that we very truthfully portray this is the more money you spend, weirdly enough, the more money you save in the long run. The closure of schools cuts off an infinite stream of maintenance on those buildings. And so we've got to find a way, somehow when we talk about this factually to make sure that people understand that. Otherwise, I agree, I think it would be, yeah, well, what's the cheapest option we can barely scrape by with? That might be the one that we're tempted to ask. The other item around, that logic question, I think that it's kind of full circle because I agree, if we're going to ask the question, it kind of implies that we have that option in our back pocket. And I'd hate to set that number until or unless we had an option in our back pocket. But if we had an option in our back pocket, maybe we should just put it on the ballot or on the survey to begin with. So I'm struggling with that a little bit, and I've got to process that a little bit. But.
And we can leave the number off. We don't have to say, again, this was discussed yesterday too. We don't have to say 50 million or 75 million and show the tax impact. But I do think what will happen is some survey takers will say, I don't know how to give you a dollar amount because I don't feel confident knowing what the tax impact will be for you. And that's maybe what we have to live with. So.
If there's a dollar amount stated, would you support, then that should be translated with the tax impact.
Right.
If you would not support any of these options, what would you support, open-ended? They could put in nothing, they could put in $1, they could put in anything, right?
Right.
It's just, what do you need? And I think that's what Jen's trying to make sure that you get back.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have enough support for 100, where do you go? Because then we are kind of like picking it out of a hat. Well, 79 sounds good, and you could be dead on, right? Right. That's what we're looking for in terms of what do you need in order to move forward.
I would be in favor. I would be in favor of leaving 3 options as it is without, because I mean, I just I don't want people to think exactly what you're saying, that we somehow have a plan would be suited by a lower number. We're just not presenting it. It's like our back. It's like when we go talk to the manager and come up with our final offer, like that's not the number we have. This is the number we have, and this isn't even the right number. We're going here because we already know it's a high number, but this is the minimum we need to get done phase 1 things. And so for me, that is already, that's the lowest number. I mean, I wouldn't want to propose or make people think that there's an option for a lower number. I wouldn't even include it because we'll know if we can't even support at the 100 level, it doesn't matter what the lower number is. We just know it's not this number, and we're already dealing with a plan that does not suit our needs. So
I think that's a good point from a scheduling perspective. So let's say we launch the survey with these options, and it comes back and there's clear lack of support for anything. Sadly, I'm in the insurance business, so we like to think the pessimistic approach and plan ahead. If that happens from a timeline perspective, right, we have to regroup, right? And does that mean that possibly November's off at that point? Is it like, yeah, that's it. So if that happens, we regroup.
But why would it be off? You throw it out there and maybe you get something passing, because if it does, if somebody says, no, we're not gonna support any at 100, 125 or 150, we can potentially still throw a 89.7 million out there, and that's the low end of potentially being able to complete phase 1.
Fair point.
And it's not 100 million, somebody might say, oh, that's quite a bit lower, even though it's only $10 million lower.
Okay, so that would be an option.
That's one way to look at what you have sort of in your back pocket.
Because if I would say, if you know, you gotta throw something out there to see where,
I would.
what's gonna stick. I mean, even if somebody, everyone says we're not gonna support it, what's it hurt to throw it on the ballot?
Well, I would suggest a little caution there. It depends on the data. If Don Huger comes back and if he shows overwhelmingly that none of the options are supported, and you're at a 10% margin, like you're at 60% no support for anything, you're not going to regroup that without a significant cut, I think. And I think there is a place in that process where you start to potentially impact the solution itself and ever recovering from that. So with a failure, you're always overcoming that failure, right? So just like you're still rebuilding from the 2019 failure, you've always got that in the narrative, you've always got that in the media, you've always got that in your history. So looking at the margin of support, I think is important about how close you do get. If you're a few percentage points off, maybe the strategy is what you're saying, to back down to your low end here. But to just go, like if you're being crushed in this survey result, we certainly would not advise you to go forward anyway, because I think there's more potential damage in that process. I mean, it's ultimately your decision, of course, but we would worry about that for you.
But I mean, the alternative, I see where John's coming from, especially considering that this election cycle probably, according to data, has one of the best chances. So, and the numbers aren't gonna get cheaper, we know that. So we decide not to go to referendum because it didn't show support, and now in April or next November, we're like, okay, well, we came up with a lesser option that actually costs the same amount as we needed last time. You know, at some point, I'm like, I kind of agree with John. I understand what you're saying about the bad press and all this stuff, but the number's not gonna go down. It's never gonna, the need's never gonna go down. The number might go down, the need's not gonna go down.
That's true.
So,
That is
I
ultimately
mean, you
the
might as
margin.
well take it when it's your, you know, the wind's at your back.
Yeah, at the bare minimum, you do 74 million, you get the new Jackson, you can potentially have room to close the schools then, and we have to figure it out from there. But, I mean, we're definitely not gonna get anything passed and put on the ballot. I mean, that's
That's a for sure.
so.
Well, ultimately, it's your
No way
decision
around
about
that
the risk reward there, and the recovery is part of it. Just a few things to pay attention to. November election that is unsuccessful is very hard to turn around for an immediate April election, because that means you have to do that in 2 months over the holidays, because April elections mean you're adopting your ballots in January. So just a little food for thought. So typically, when we see a November election fail, you're not back on the ballot right away in April. You're on the ballot a year later. But in this case, there is no November election in an odd year, which is November 25. So practically, if you are unsuccessful in November of 24, you're probably not back on the ballot before April of 26, which means the time frame of all of the solutions just escalates that much further out. So it's just, these are all the variables that we think about when we think about survey data, how close are you, what should you ask for, guiding that, because it is really hard to pivot between November and April election successfully, and there is no November in the fall of 25.
And then April, then you're only 6 months from the gubernatorial, which is the second most successful.
It's just timing factors to consider, which is why we've been, to your point, really looking at November ever since we first came on board last year as a critical milestone for you to get there and to, you know, if your community is supportive.
I think if the consensus of this board is that, which is what I've been hearing, is that we are going to have a referendum in November, and really the data that we're gleaning here is, what is that going to look like? I think that, you know, that's an easier conversation to have, unless it's absolutely, you know, astronomically bad. Then it's a different conversation that we can have, but I agree, I'd rather shoot our shot than not.
So what additional feedback are you looking for from the board? Next steps?
Well, I think I heard that there's not a logic question with a number. Is that what you heard, Perry?
That's what I heard as well.
Yeah, is it an open-ended logic question? If not these options, what are your thoughts? Do you want that at all, or do you just not even want to include that logic?
I'm not sure that an open-ended question is ultimately terribly helpful. I mean, others can disagree, but but because it's a number that's not necessarily anchored without them knowing lots of components and pieces, you know,
It's just an open-ended field for them to say, nope, I don't like any of these.
right?
And
Not everyone may necessarily answer that question. So it's not like we're getting, right, if someone says, I love option 2, they're not necessarily answering the logic question, correct? So that means we're not going to hear from a great statistical sample necessarily as to
Very
what a
true.
successful number would be.
Yeah.
But others do it, and so Harry, please advise us.
Or what if you had,
And I will tell you, Chris, that everyone will see an open-ended question asking them for final thoughts once they're done with the 3 options. So
Okay,
if we remove that, fresh on people's minds, they can tell us, you know, tax impact was too high, I'm mad about you trying to close schools, whatever the case might be, they have other opportunities for, again, that opportunity there is again as well.
so
So,
that would be my suggestion is, what if the logic question is, if they don't support any of the plans listed, please check the option that most closely resembles why you didn't support it, and then we just give them a set amount of options, like, you know, I didn't like the schools that were closing, I don't like, I don't like the tax impact, just a generic, I don't approve the cost, or under no circumstances will I support the West Bend School District, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, maybe we just list 3 questions that are pretty summary of like what would be 80% of the reasons why people wouldn't support it. And we just give those 3 options so we can get a feel of what it is. Because if the whole reason is, if everyone's saying, well, I don't like the schools that are closing, then maybe that's something that we just need to have better messaging about. Or if it's the tax impact is too high, then we just know, like, they support the school district, they're just not gonna support it at this number, versus the option that says, I just don't support the West Bend School District, or I don't want to
Sure.
contribute to that.
we're working with a school district now that had an April operational referendum that failed. And there is a question on their survey that goes live in early May, where we give about a series of 6 things that they can select
Sure.
for why, and they, you know, we can't ask them if they voted no, because we're not trying to identify that, but what were the reasons why someone might have opposed it? So a little bit like what was asked at the conversation. So, yeah, we could do that to at least glean that information from folks. So, I guess I'd like to at least put those things in there rather than having them fill it in, because again, then we can investigate that data.
That's what I was suggesting, give us a fixed amount of options so that we can actually use the data.
yeah.
Not trying to put
We talked
together.
about that a little bit yesterday too. It's a good idea.
Other thoughts, comments? The feedback this group is looking from the board.
Well, I think that was really helpful, and we can continue to fine tune this. I just want you to be aware of the timeline and the importance of the data collecting for the summer work. And if you guys are wanting to roll with them, then we'll roll with you. So it's just a matter of what do you feel comfortable doing and how do you get there?
I guess last question, is there anything at the present time, I'm thinking back to that Excel chart with all the colors, the project plan basically, the milestones.
Sure.
Where we are today, are we on track?
You're absolutely right on
Great.
track.
Good to know.
Maybe,
Unless you want to revise the survey dramatically. then
I like
Hey, hey.
And we're gonna keep you on track too.
That's right, I just want to be sure we're not, I sense not. so
maybe
thank you.
one important date though, that August 27th, so that's the board resolution that you're approving. It's the resolution, the wording of the question. You don't want to back up against that. That's the statutory date, and that's Tuesday. Oh, let's have a board meeting on Monday.
No.
You don't want to hold tight to that. So that whole July, August, really a lot of the fine tuning and the finalization of this in August, so maybe like the first board meeting could be the resolution, because otherwise you get really tight with that, so just keep that in mind.
And it also matters for communication, because we have, by far, we know this, Nancy knows this, the most engagement from families is right at the start of the school year. So people are fresh and they actually care about the things you're sending them by email. So we want to be able to maximize that, as are just generally community members. So we want to be able to pivot away from what you're, how to get there and making a decision into what is actually on the ballot and communicating and beginning to answer all those questions. And so, to Andy's point, if we had a little more time in August to prepare that material and begin that communications effort with the start of school, that's great timing.
Anything else? Board members, guests?
Perry, did you get what you need?
I did, I'm gonna survey now and do some more work, so thank you, everybody, so.
Great. Board members, any objections to adjourning? All right, it is 6:27 PM and we are adjourned by consensus. Thanks, everyone.